Welcome to Conversations Live. For more than a decade, we've brought you the best in books, entertainment, and current events. When the movers and shakers of the world have something to say to you, they say it to us first. And now, celebrating 15 years of broadcasting, here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
And welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again. Whether you're tuning in on the radio dial here in Mississippi at WYAD 94.1 FM, we welcome you all back to our show. Also, those tuning in through online affiliates around the world, including our iHeartRadio family. We're glad to have all of you with us as well. We're excited to welcome Corey Dolgon back to our program today. Corey wrote a book that I had a chance to discuss with him last year called Kill It to Save It, an autopsy of capitalism's triumph over democracy. Corey's book is being made available in paperback this month. We're going to talk to him not only about that release, but also what it's been like for him to have these conversations with individuals like yourselves about not only, of course, what has happened along the years in this country, but also what we can do to turn things around. And that's what I love about this book, is that it not only addresses the things that are wrong, but also gives us an idea of how we can be able to make it right. If you're just now hearing about the book, we'll tell you at the end of our segment how you can get your own copy of it. But Corey, hello to you and welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Cyrus. Pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is definitely all mine. So let's talk about this year for you, Corey. As I said, it's been a year since the book was initially released in hardcover. What has it been like for you to be a part of these conversations about what you've discussed in the book, what's happened along the years in this country, Corey, but also the actions that can be taken to reverse the course?
Sure. It's been pretty exciting to travel around the country. We've been in over almost 36 now bookstores around the country, mostly independent bookstores, about the same number of radio interviews on shows like yours. And it seems to me that there are two pressing issues that I was able to talk a little bit about in the paperback as a postscript. One is that people are not sitting still, standing still, being quiet in the face of the Donald Trump regime, and I only want to kind of individualize it as a shorthand. One of the things that you may remember we talked about the first time around was that the book was written with the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win the White House, and that I really pinned the blame for this kind of kill it to save it policymaking, the destruction of the public sector in order to make more profit for the private sector, and the kind of hyper-individualism that was used to sell such policies that tried to convince people that what was good for corporate profit was really good for America. I pin the blame for that on the Democrats as well as the Republicans. It's really about neoliberalism. It's really about a kind of corporate takeover of our ideology. And so the fact that Donald Trump did in the end win seemed to me only the hyper-crystallization of kill it to save it into this one kind of person and what they stood for. And certainly his policymaking, as I suggest in the postscript, has been, kill it to save it on steroids. Choosing, in some ways, the perfect people to run agencies in which their primary function is to destroy what those agencies do. And certainly the EPA under Scott Pruitt is a prime example, but it's true in education with Betsy DeVos. It's true in energy with Rick Perry and down the line. So what I've seen around the country is that people are responding to this in ways in which they don't always know what the one solution might be, but they know that the first solution is to actually be active. And so people are taking to the streets, people are organizing in their communities, people are going to meetings around the country to try and figure out new candidates to run for office. And really, I think getting prepared for what may come to pass, which is if the Democrats can't be a progressive party again, which they only show signs once in a while of being able to do that, then a lot of very progressive people looking for alternatives will say a pox on both your houses and create some kind of alternative political force. But that activism and that mobilization of people is one of the most exciting things that I've seen. But the second thing is that people want to consider thinking outside the box. And that is, while there's a lot of emphasis in the media on the 2018 and the 2020 elections, going back to my hesitancy about, individualizing what really needs to be a movement against neoliberalism and a movement against this kill it to save it ideology. The fact of the matter is that Trump has inspired a lot of people. The issue is we can't simply run against Trump, and we can't simply run politicians in elections and hoping that they're going to do a better job. We really need to start looking at an analysis like Kill It to Save It and suggest we need to come up with alternative policies that really do put people first, that rebuild public institutions and recreate a public sector in this country that not only gave us the middle class, but really brought us in some ways to the precipice of a society that believed that it could do better for the people who live in it.
Right. For sure. And I think, too, there are different groups that we see emerging as well. I want to read just a couple of sentences from the chapter part 2, Corey, and have us talk about it, and the interesting parallel to how this can be actually talking about 2018. This is what you wrote in part 2. The sense of activism among students not only awoke the nation from a political slumber and gave way to revolutionary consciousness, but also created a belief in and even a commitment to putting one's body on the line. Now, one could think that they were talking about the movements that we've seen this year with students in 2018 in the wake of the gun violence. However, you're actually referring to something that happened in the 1960s. So when you saw what was taking place this year, Corey, this is my question, did it remind you of movements like that you wrote about that took place in the 1960s?
Somewhat, and I think these are the murmurings of possible movements to that degree. I mean, you have to remember that the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the anti-war movement were at least in part revolutionary movements. They took place they changed the very foundation of the structure of segregation in the society. And I think that for anyone in the 1940s or 1930s or even the first part of the 1950s to think that within a decade and a half, a primarily student movement, and not just students, certainly Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Urban League, CORE, there are a number of different groups that were all part of the civil rights movement. But to think that they could really taking leadership from the radical nature of the student movement, bring down segregation, nobody would have believed it. And so when we look around, especially in the 50s under McCarthy, when we look around, today and think about the ways in which the right wing of this country has trounced democracy and through voting fraud laws and a whole variety of other ways, taken rights away from people. The way corporate America and racist America has resegregated our cities with various, not just real estate practices of old, but really in some ways the real estate practices of the new, which is the gentrification of neighborhoods and the pushing out of people. We're at the precipice of a desperate need for serious radical change. And what we're seeing now is that kind of murmuring of activism. We're seeing these students, and anyone who's watched these clips of student speeches or seen them, gone out to the demonstrations. These are not teenagers who are kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a trauma that they experienced, although obviously they experienced the trauma. But these are really sharp students who are trying to bring what we talk about in sociology as intersectionality to the forefront of this movement. It's not just about making schools safer. It's about ending the poverty and violence in urban communities. And so when relatively privileged white students who experience this shooting get up and say, this issue can't be addressed unless we address gun violence in Chicago or Baltimore, or anywhere else around the country where young people, and particularly young people of color, are facing this level of gun violence, that means that they are not going to settle for bum stock legislation. They're not going to settle for closing loopholes at gun shows. And one has to hope they won't settle, perhaps to say early on in this struggle, because they're recognizing that their struggle is part of a larger one, which really has to do with the power of the corporate sector.
For sure. We're going to talk more about that for sure, Corey. I want to say for those who are just tuning in, either on the radio side or online, you're listening to Conversations Live. We're excited to welcome back to our program today author Corey Dolgon. He's the author of the book called Kill It to Save It. That's available in paperback this month, an autopsy of capitalism's triumph over democracy. You raised some really interesting points in this book in a broad sense, Corey, that I honestly, and when reading the book initially last year, I thought to myself, how did this happen? Where you look at the individuals who are in the most need. How do they sometimes end up going against their own interest? What is it that drives that? And, I thought about, one thing, education being important, not so much talking about, of course, as you know, education in school, but just education of what the issues are and who is looking out for you when it comes to those issues. Do you think that's been one of the big things? Because I kind of equate it with myself in school, how in school there are individuals who are drawn to people because of their popularity, because of where they live, because of feeling some type of commonality with them, and they then would align themselves with them when it came to student council voting and that kind of thing, whether they believed in what the person was doing or not. It's just, hey, I can connect with this person. I believe I'm like this person. Do you think there's been too much of that and not enough looking at what this person is actually going to do for me or against me?
Absolutely. I think you're right on the issue there. And we talk a lot about the media. In some ways, we talk about it the way we talk about the weather. It's this kind of unchangeable system that hovers around us. Certainly the role that places like Fox News and now Breitbart and what's called the alt-right, their saturation of the airwaves we can just call them lies, but it's not simply lies. They're the kinds of stories that will touch people in ways and tap into some core values while feeding them, the worst kind of toxins. So, for instance, it's hard to think of the United States as not a racist country from its core, and we can go back to the Constitution and we can go back to the genocide of Native Americans, with the Constitution not only legalizing slavery but kind of ensconcing the protection of slavery, not as a compromise between the North and the South, but as part of the very DNA of our government. And despite the Civil Rights Movement and despite abolition and despite Reconstruction, we have never been able to excoriate that very lifeblood of white supremacy in our nation's bloodstream. And so, we do better at times than other times. And, in the movement, in the labor movement to some degree, certainly in the Civil Rights Movement, we've seen people come up with alternative narratives to this white supremacy that have been powerful movement makers. But, once those movements tend to end, we also see a backslide. And I would say that really since the Reagan era, we've seen, the rise of a new kind of virulent white racism that was clearly evident and still evident in Donald Trump's campaign narrative. And so when we think about who these people are who are constantly being sold a bill of goods by Fox News and Breitbart and others, we know that the overwhelming audience is white, and we know that unfortunately, one of the histories of race has been the history of white people often accepting arguments that their issues, their problems, their lack of jobs or lost wages or poor wages are not the result of corporations trying to extract as much profit as possible, but it's because there's another group that's to blame, because they've taken the good jobs, or they've driven down the wages of even working class jobs, or they're taking our jobs, or they're making crime in our community. And we can come up with these narratives over and over again. And unfortunately, people are very susceptible to believing that it's these other people they don't know, because as you suggested, I think, very rightly, they're not like us. And so I would say that the Republicans in particular, a very right wing, a very racist Republican Party, has been able to go to the working class and go to the middle classes, primarily white people in those classes, and explain to them that the reason they've been doing poorly, because Kill It to Save It has in fact destroyed the public sector that supported them, the reason that's happened is because all these other people have showed up at their door, in this case particularly Latinos. But it's also the fault of welfare. Welfare now makes up, less than 1% of our federal budget, but people are still running against welfare fraud as if that had any significant impact on our economy. But they're able to do it time and time again because they tap in to these American values, and unfortunately one of the American values that we've had since the beginning is racism.
Yeah. I think, and it goes in so many different levels. I mean, what you write in the book about food, I think will really make people think a whole lot about what's happened there. Of course, education, as you mentioned, that's one of the issues that's come up. In the chapter, Shock Doctrines, Disaster, Capitalism, you wrote this, and I think, again, it's another big point. I'm just going to read a part of it and have us talk about it, Corey, and that is this. The idea that companies could not only take advantage of social upheavals, but also cause, promote, maintain, and legislate them for the sake of economic profit is an extremely frightening one, but all too real. We live in a state of perpetual shock and thus support policies that promise to create prosperity and liberate us from fear, regardless of their actual impact, which is usually to prosper the wealthy and leave the rest of us more vulnerable. I don't think it can be said any plainer than that. So the big question is, why is it that people can't see it?
Yeah, it's a good question because, I think of two things in particular. I end the book with the example of Flint, Michigan, and there's a constructed crisis, right? There's the situation of the state of Michigan under very conservative Republican leadership, essentially creating laws that strip democracy away from communities, imposed people, city managers on communities that were selected by the governor. And then the creation of policies, so we've destroyed democracy, right? And then creating policies that, in order to save money, destroyed the community by poisoning them. We bomb Syria for poisoning their own people, but we haven't seen the U.S. government go into Michigan and even address the situation, let alone thinking of arresting and imprisoning the leader of the state of Michigan for poisoning his own people. Right. So there's this situation where we're watching the destruction of a community, and we seem to have, as a country, been able to grasp some semblance of it, but I don't think we can get to the root of it. And that probably has to do because we simply have way too much faith in this notion of America as a democracy. And the book I'm working on right now is called American Fascism, and I'm trying to really question those very mythologies, looking at the kinds of tyranny that were at work in the very formation of the nation. But even if we look at what's best about our country, the history of social movements that have brought us some semblance of democracy, it's why I really start the book in the late 1960s. I'm looking at this particular moment where we were watching all of these social movements bring forward a sense of the possibility of America as a democratic nation, and the ways in which we've really created this great U-turn since Reagan in taking away that democracy, and that gets at what you were talking about, what you're asking about, the ability for the government and corporations to create this sense of disaster, excuse me, real or imagined, natural or man-made, and use it as an opportunity to both degrade democracy and enhance corporate profit. And so whether it was Katrina or 9/11, excuse me, you'll watch the the creation of policies that seem to be addressing one problem, but in essence are really crafted to enrich a small segment of the population and not address what the basic problems were even before the disaster began. So the privatization of education in New Orleans is a case in point where, they try to compare test scores now with before Katrina, now that most of the school district in New Orleans has been privatized. Well, the only advantage to showing some higher test scores now is that before Katrina, New Orleans had one of the worst school districts in the country. It was one of the poorest communities in the country, and their schools were some of the poorest funded. And so Katrina has not given them an opportunity to bring in resources to create a new, stronger, better resourced and better effective public sector. What it did was it created the opportunity to privatize the schools and reap more profit. And the fact that you can show some small test scores increased in some schools, not all, is not a testament to privatization. It's a testament to essentially how badly disinvested was the tragedy of New Orleans public education even before Katrina happened.
For sure. A lot for us to be able to discuss, which is why I'm glad now people are being reintroduced to the book, Corey, as it is being released in paperback this month. Again, Corey Dolgon has been our guest. Kill It to Save It is the title of the book, An Autopsy of Capitalism's Triumph Over Democracy. It's available now, of course, for you all to get through our friends at Amazon.com or through your favorite bookstore as well. Corey, let our audience know, how can they stay connected with you and keep up with updates about what you're doing with the book?
Sure. I want to encourage folks to reach out to me via email. I'm happy to. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. It's cdolgon@stonehill.edu. Stonehill College is where I teach, and I'm also an open book on Facebook. And so most of my interviews and most of my appearances are posted up on Facebook. And if people want to follow me there, they can get as big a dose of me as they'd like.
Well, make sure you all are definitely staying connected with Corey. Corey, thank you so much for that. The book is also, I should say, published by Policy Press, so make sure you are staying connected with them online as well. And definitely thank all of you for tuning in to another great segment of Conversations Live. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb, saying, as always, enjoy your day, enjoy your life, enjoy your world. Make sure you take out time to enjoy some good music as well as a great book. Thank you all for choosing Conversations Live today. You all make it a great one.